The cruelest invitations are not the ones that ask you to come. They are the ones that hope you never recovered. The cream-colored envelope rested on Naomi Carter's kitchen counter like a ghost from another lifetime. Outside her penthouse window, the Chicago skyline shimmered beneath the soft glow of a spring sunset, turning the glass towers downtown into pillars of gold and fire. The city looked peaceful from 32 floors above the streets, but Naomi's eyes remained fixed on the elegant handwriting etched across the envelope. She had recognized it instantly. Ethan Whitmore. 3 years. 3 years since the divorce papers. 3 years since the man she once loved had walked away believing he had broken something inside her that would never heal. 3 years since she had packed 2 suitcases, left the mansion she helped build, and disappeared from the social circles that had celebrated her when she was useful and forgotten her when she was not. Slowly, she picked up the envelope and unfolded the invitation inside. Thick ivory cardstock, gold embossed lettering, luxury on display. Exactly the kind of statement Ethan always loved making. Naomi's dark eyes moved across the page until they reached the handwritten note near the bottom. Her fingers tightened slightly. Hope you'll come and see how far I've moved on. The words were simple, polite even, but Naomi knew Ethan too well. Every sentence he ever spoke carried 2 meanings. One for the room, one for the target. A faint smile touched her lips. Not because the message amused her, because it confirmed what she had suspected all along. Ethan Whitmore was still looking over his shoulder. The silence in the apartment stretched around her. The soft jazz playing from hidden speakers. The scent of vanilla and sandalwood drifting from a candle near the bookshelf. The polished black grand piano she had bought after signing her first major investment deal. Everything surrounding her now had been earned after the collapse. After the humiliation. After the nights she had sat alone wondering whether losing everything had somehow made her stronger or simply colder. She walked toward the floor-to-ceiling windows and stared at the city below. Somewhere beyond those lights stood the luxury hotel where Ethan's wedding would take place in less than 2 weeks. She could already imagine it. Crystal chandeliers, designer gowns, wealthy guests sipping champagne while congratulating the groom. And somewhere during the evening, Ethan would tell a story, perhaps several stories. Stories carefully crafted to remind everyone how fortunate he had been to escape his first marriage. Stories designed to make Naomi the punchline. Her phone vibrated softly on the marble countertop. The screen displayed a familiar name. Ava Reynolds. Her closest friend. Naomi answered. Tell me you're not thinking about going. Ava's voice arrived before the greeting. Naomi glanced once more at the invitation. I'm thinking about it. A long pause followed. Naomi. What? You know exactly why he invited you. Naomi looked down at the city, traffic flowing like rivers of white and red light through the streets below. Yes, she said quietly. I do. Ava sighed. Then don't give him what he wants. Naomi's reflection stared back at her from the glass. Stronger than before. Calmer than before. The woman looking back no longer resembled the devastated wife who had walked away 3 years earlier. Maybe, Naomi said softly, showing up isn't giving him what he wants. The line went silent. Even Ava seemed uncertain how to respond. Naomi lowered the phone and looked once more at the invitation resting on the table behind her. Across the city, preparations for a wedding were already underway. Guests were confirming attendance. Vendors were finalizing details. A bride was preparing for the happiest day of her life. And somewhere, Ethan Whitmore was probably smiling, convinced he had created the perfect trap. What he did not know was that the woman he thought he had destroyed had already survived far worse than embarrassment. And what none of them knew was that before the wedding day ended, one person would stand up, take hold of a microphone, and change every single life inside that ballroom forever. The rain had been falling the night Ethan Whitmore asked for a divorce. Naomi remembered that detail more clearly than the words themselves. The droplets had slid down the enormous windows of their lakefront mansion, blurring the city lights beyond the glass into streaks of silver and gold. Back then she had still believed storms passed. She had not yet learned that some people brought the storm with them. Ethan stood near the fireplace that evening, perfectly composed in a tailored navy suit despite having nowhere left to go. He looked more like a man preparing for a board meeting than a husband ending a marriage. Naomi sat across from him, her hands wrapped around a mug of tea that had long since gone cold. The silence between them stretched so wide it felt impossible to cross. Finally, Ethan broke it. This is not working anymore. For simple words. No anger. No shouting. No tears. Just cold precision. The kind that left deeper scars because it sounded rehearsed. Naomi had stared at him, waiting for the explanation that never came. Waiting for the husband she thought she knew to appear somewhere behind the stranger sitting in front of her. But Ethan only continued speaking in the calm voice that had impressed investors and executives for years. He talked about growth, about different paths, about incompatibility, corporate language disguised as personal truth. What he never mentioned was that Naomi had spent 8 years helping him build everything he now claimed as his own. She remembered the tiny apartment they had shared when they first married. 700 square feet. One aging air conditioner that rattled every summer. Cheap takeout dinners balanced on cardboard boxes because they could not afford a dining table. She remembered proofreading business proposals after working 10-hour shifts. Reviewing contracts late into the night. Encouraging him after failed deals and disappointing meetings. Every victory had belonged to both of them then. At least that was what she believed. Success changed Ethan gradually, the way winter changes a landscape. Not all at once. Little by little. The promotions arrived. Then the magazine features. Then the private jets, exclusive clubs, and elite social circles. Somewhere along the way, gratitude became entitlement. Partnership became hierarchy. Naomi noticed it first in small moments. Invitations that arrived addressed only to Ethan. Conversations where people treated her like decorative furniture. Events where introductions focused on his accomplishments while ignoring hers completely. Ethan never corrected them. Over time, he seemed to enjoy it. The final months of the marriage felt like living inside a beautiful museum after closing hours. Everything appeared perfect. Nothing felt alive. Then came the divorce. Fast. Efficient. Public. The newspapers framed it as an amicable separation. Business blogs praised Ethan's professionalism during a difficult personal transition. Friends disappeared. Invitations stopped arriving. People chose proximity to power. Naomi understood. She simply refused to chase them. For months afterward, she rebuilt her life quietly. She studied, invested, worked longer hours than anyone realized. While others discussed her downfall, she focused on her future. One opportunity became 2. 2 became 10. Years passed. The woman everyone assumed had been left behind continued moving forward. Now, standing beside the window of her Chicago penthouse, Naomi looked at her reflection in the glass. The city glittered beneath her. Strong, steady, unbroken. The invitation still rested on the marble counter behind her. A reminder of the past attempting to reclaim space in the present. Her phone buzzed again. This time a news notification appeared across the screen. A photograph filled the display. Ethan Whitmore smiling beside his fiancée at a charity gala. Naomi studied the image for a moment before setting the phone down. Her expression never changed. She felt no jealousy, no anger, no regret, only curiosity. Because for the first time in years, she found herself wondering not who Ethan had become, but whether the woman standing beside him knew who he truly was. And 2 weeks later, she would finally discover the answer. 2 weeks later, the Grand Regent Hotel rose above downtown Chicago like a monument to wealth and celebration. Its glass facade reflected the afternoon sun, scattering light across the crowded entrance where luxury cars arrived one after another. Inside, crystal chandeliers hung from soaring ceilings, casting warm gold across polished marble floors. The wedding had become one of the city's most talked-about social events. Business leaders, investors, politicians, and media personalities filled the ballroom, all eager to witness the union between Ethan Whitmore and Victoria Sinclair. Naomi arrived 15 minutes before the ceremony. No entourage, no dramatic entrance, no attempt to attract attention. She stepped from a black sedan, wearing an elegant black dress that flowed with quiet sophistication. A pair of diamond earrings caught the sunlight as she crossed the sidewalk. The look was simple, refined, confident. The kind of confidence that no longer required approval from anyone else. Inside the lobby, conversations softened as heads turned. Recognition moved through the crowd in waves. Some guests remembered her immediately. Others needed a moment. But eventually the whispers began. Naomi Carter, Ethan's ex-wife. She came. Naomi heard none of it. Or perhaps she heard all of it, and simply chose not to react. Her heels clicked softly against the marble as she followed a hostess toward the ballroom entrance. The massive doors stood open beneath arrangements of white roses and orchids. Beyond them stretched a sea of tailored suits and designer gowns. Laughter floated through the air. Champagne glasses shimmered beneath the chandeliers. Everything looked perfect. Too perfect. Naomi accepted a glass of sparkling water from a passing server and moved toward a quiet corner near one of the floor-to-ceiling windows. She had been there less than 3 minutes when she felt a familiar presence approaching. Ethan Whitmore. The room seemed to shift around him. He still carried himself with the same polished confidence that had once impressed everyone he met. His tuxedo fit perfectly. His smile appeared effortless. Yet Naomi noticed something she had not expected. The moment his eyes landed on her, he paused. Just briefly. A fraction of a second. But enough. "Naomi," he said. "You actually came." She met his gaze calmly. "You invited me." A few nearby guests pretended not to listen. Their attention never left the conversation. Ethan smiled. "I honestly was not sure you would." Naomi took a sip of water. "Then why send the invitation?" For a moment his smile tightened. Then it returned. "I thought it would be nice for old friends to celebrate together." The answer sounded rehearsed. Naomi almost admired the effort. How thoughtful. Ethan glanced around the ballroom. "I hope seeing all this is not uncomfortable." Naomi followed his gaze across the room. The flowers. The orchestra preparing near the stage. The luxury. The spectacle. Then she looked back at him. Why would it be? His expression flickered again. Small. Nearly invisible. Disappointment. He had expected something. Hurt. Jealousy. Regret. Instead, he found none of it. Before Ethan could respond, movement near the grand staircase drew everyone's attention. The guests turned as Victoria Sinclair appeared above them. A soft murmur spread through the ballroom. She looked stunning in a timeless ivory gown, poised and elegant beneath the golden light. Yet as her eyes swept across the crowd, they unexpectedly landed on Naomi. Their gazes met for only a second, long enough for something curious to pass between them. Not hostility, not triumph. Something else. Something Naomi could not quite identify. Then Victoria smiled politely and continued down the staircase. Across the room, Ethan released a breath he seemed unaware he had been holding. Naomi noticed, and for the first time that afternoon, she began to suspect that someone in this ballroom was far more nervous than she was. The ceremony began beneath a canopy of white roses suspended from crystal arches that seemed to float beneath the ballroom ceiling. Soft music drifted through the air while hundreds of guests settled into their seats. From her place near the back of the room, Naomi watched the scene unfold with quiet detachment. It felt less like a wedding and more like a carefully choreographed performance. Every detail had been polished to perfection. Every smile appeared rehearsed. Every camera angle seemed designed to capture a fairy tale. Ethan stood at the front of the ballroom beside the officiant, greeting guests with the confidence of a man accustomed to admiration. Yet the closer Naomi looked, the more she noticed subtle cracks beneath the surface. His laughter came a fraction too quickly. His smile lingered a fraction too long. It was the expression of someone trying very hard to appear comfortable. The ceremony itself was elegant. Victoria moved through the aisle with effortless grace while guests watched in admiration. The golden light from the chandeliers reflected against the diamonds at her ears. She looked every bit the future Mrs. Whitmore. Yet twice during the ceremony, Naomi noticed Victoria glance toward her. Not long enough to draw attention. Not obvious enough to seem intentional, but enough to feel deliberate. The vows concluded. Applause filled the ballroom. Cameras flashed. Guests rose to their feet. From a distance, it appeared to be the perfect beginning. An hour later, the celebration moved into the grand reception hall. The atmosphere transformed immediately. Champagne flowed. Music filled the room. Waiters circulated carrying silver trays beneath towering arrangements of orchids and white lilies. The energy became louder, more relaxed, more dangerous. Naomi had expected that part. Weddings often revealed the truth people spent entire ceremonies hiding. She remained near the edge of the room, speaking briefly with a few familiar faces who seemed surprised to find her calm and successful rather than broken and bitter. The assumptions amused her more than they offended her. Then Ethan stepped onto the stage. The room quieted. A spotlight settled over him as he raised a champagne glass. "Thank you all for being here tonight," he began. Warm laughter and applause followed. The speech started exactly as expected. Gratitude, family, friendship, success. Then came the shift, so subtle that many guests probably missed it. Life has a funny way of teaching lessons, Ethan said with a smile. Sometimes people enter your life for a season rather than forever. A few guests laughed knowingly. Ethan continued, and sometimes failure becomes the greatest gift because it clears the path for something better. More laughter, more nods. Naomi remained perfectly still. She knew exactly where this was going. Ethan's eyes found her across the room. I think we all learn eventually that holding on to the wrong chapter prevents us from reaching the right ending. This time several heads turned toward Naomi. The room grew slightly quieter. Some guests shifted uncomfortably. Others looked curious. Ethan smiled wider. Fortunately, life has a way of correcting mistakes. The sentence landed exactly as he intended. Not openly cruel. Not openly hostile. Just sharp enough to humiliate while maintaining plausible innocence. Naomi lowered her champagne glass and met his gaze. She offered no reaction. No anger. No embarrassment. No defense. Only calm. For the first time all evening, Ethan seemed disappointed. He had expected the comment to provoke something. Instead, it disappeared into silence. Across the room, Victoria's smile faded. Her eyes moved slowly from Ethan to Naomi and back again. The change was almost invisible, but Naomi noticed it immediately. While the guests resumed their conversations and the orchestra began another song, Victoria continued watching. Not Ethan. Naomi. As though she were trying to solve a puzzle that suddenly no longer fit the picture she had been given. And at that exact moment, Naomi realized something important. Ethan believed he was controlling the room. He believed he was directing the story. What he failed to see was that the one person whose opinion mattered most had begun paying very close attention. The evening continued beneath a canopy of crystal light and carefully maintained smiles. But something fundamental had shifted inside the ballroom. Victoria Sinclair felt it first. She stood near the head table accepting congratulations, posing for photographs, and thanking guests with practiced grace. Yet her attention kept drifting toward the woman in black standing across the room. Naomi never competed for attention. That was what made her impossible to ignore. Most people placed in her position would have left long ago or fought to defend themselves. Naomi had done neither. She simply existed with a quiet confidence that seemed to unsettle everyone around her. Victoria found herself replaying Ethan's speech in her mind. At first, the comments had sounded harmless. Then she remembered the direction of his gaze, the timing, the subtle reactions from the guests. Suddenly, the entire exchange felt different, calculated, intentional. As the orchestra played a slow, instrumental piece, Victoria excused herself from a group of investors and stepped onto a private balcony overlooking the Chicago River. The cool evening air carried the distant sound of traffic and city life below. For the first time all day, she was alone. Or so she thought. Beautiful view, isn't it? The voice came from behind her. Victoria turned to find Margaret Collins approaching. Margaret was one of Chicago's most respected philanthropic leaders and had known Ethan professionally for years. Victoria smiled politely. It really is. Margaret joined her near the railing. For a moment, neither woman spoke. Then Margaret glanced through the ballroom windows toward Naomi. She handled that remarkably well. Victoria followed her gaze. Naomi. Margaret nodded. Most people do not know the full story. Victoria's curiosity sharpened instantly. What story? Margaret hesitated. I assumed Ethan told you. The silence that followed seemed to answer the question. Margaret's expression changed almost immediately. Concern replaced casual conversation. Perhaps I should not say more. No, Victoria said gently. Please. Margaret looked back toward the ballroom. Years ago, when Ethan was still trying to establish himself, Naomi was the one keeping everything together. She believed in him when very few people did. Victoria listened carefully. I know they were married. Margaret gave a quiet laugh. Married, yes. But that hardly describes it. She was his partner in every sense of the word. Victoria felt a knot forming in her stomach. That is not how he described it. Margaret's eyes softened. I suspected as much. Before Victoria could ask another question, a wedding coordinator appeared at the balcony entrance requesting her attention inside. Guests were gathering for another round of speeches. The moment ended, yet the questions remained. Back inside, Victoria moved through the crowd with a different awareness. She began noticing details she had overlooked before. Certain guests avoided discussing Naomi in Ethan's presence. Others seemed uncomfortable whenever his marriage was mentioned. More than once she caught people exchanging glances before changing the subject entirely. The pattern was impossible to ignore. Across the room, Naomi stood near one of the towering windows watching the city lights reflected across the river. She looked peaceful, unbothered, as though she had already made peace with a chapter everyone else remained trapped inside. Victoria found herself wondering what kind of woman could survive public humiliation and emerge stronger rather than bitter. Then she noticed something else. Several former employees from Ethan's early company approached Naomi throughout the evening. They greeted her warmly, respectfully. Their admiration appeared genuine. Not one of them approached Ethan the same way. A small chill moved through Victoria despite the warmth of the ballroom. Because for the first time since becoming engaged, she found herself asking a question she had never considered before. What if the story she had been told was not the truth at all? The questions followed Victoria through the reception like shadows she could no longer ignore. Every smile directed toward her felt slightly different now. Every conversation seemed layered with meanings she had missed earlier. Near midnight, the ballroom glowed beneath crystal chandeliers while guests moved between tables wrapped in music, laughter, and celebration. Yet for Victoria, the room had begun to feel strangely divided. On one side stood the version of Ethan she thought she knew. On the other stood a growing collection of details that refused to fit together. Determined to quiet her doubts, she slipped away from the crowd and entered one of the hotel's private lounges. The room overlooked the river through enormous windows that reflected the city lights like scattered diamonds. A few guests occupied distant corners, speaking softly over drinks. Near the fireplace sat Daniel Mercer, one of Ethan's earliest business partners. Victoria recognized him immediately. If anyone understood the company's beginnings, it would be Daniel. She approached with a polite smile. "Mind if I join you?" Daniel stood and pulled out a chair. Of course. For several minutes, they exchanged casual conversation. Business, travel, charity projects. Then Victoria carefully guided the discussion toward Ethan's early years. Daniel's expression softened with nostalgia. Those days were something else. Victoria smiled. "You knew him before the success?" Daniel laughed quietly. "Before the success, before the headlines, before anyone cared who we were." He swirled the ice in his glass. "Back then there were only a handful of us trying to keep the company alive." Victoria hesitated before asking the question. Was Naomi involved? Daniel looked genuinely surprised. Involved? He leaned back. "Victoria, there probably would not have been a company without Naomi." The answer landed harder than Victoria expected. Daniel continued. "She managed operations when we could not afford managers. She reviewed contracts. She found investors. More than once she kept payroll from collapsing." Victoria stared at him. "Ethan never mentioned that." Daniel's smile disappeared. "Really?" Silence settled between them. Across the room the fire crackled softly. Daniel seemed to realize something. "What exactly did he tell you?" Victoria looked toward the ballroom through the glass doors. Beyond them, she could see Ethan laughing with a group of investors. Confident, charming, untouchable. He said they grew apart. He said she never believed in the vision. Daniel let out a slow breath. "That is not the story I remember." Victoria felt the knot in her stomach tighten further. She thanked him and returned to the reception. But now the room looked different. Everywhere she turned she saw evidence contradicting the narrative she had accepted. Former employees greeted Naomi with warmth and gratitude. Several investors spoke highly of her integrity. One executive even referred to her as the smartest strategist he had ever worked beside. Yet Ethan had described her as someone who simply could not keep up with his ambitions. The contradictions became impossible to ignore. Across the ballroom, Naomi stood alone near the window once again, gazing toward the river. She carried herself with the calm confidence of someone who no longer needed to prove her worth. Victoria watched her for a long moment. Then something unexpected happened. Naomi turned slightly, and their eyes met. Neither woman smiled. Neither looked away. For a brief moment, there was only silent understanding. One woman searching for the truth, the other carrying it. Then a wedding coordinator hurried toward Victoria. "The final speeches begin in 15 minutes. Victoria nodded automatically, but her attention remained fixed on Naomi. because deep down she had already reached a troubling realization. The more she learned about the past, the less she trusted the man she had just married. And somewhere beneath the music, the laughter, and the luxury surrounding them, the foundation of the entire evening had begun to crack. The final round of speeches was scheduled to be the highlight of the evening. Guests gradually returned to their tables, while servers refreshed glasses, and the orchestra softened into a gentle instrumental melody. From a distance, the reception still appeared flawless. Crystal chandeliers sparkled overhead. Laughter drifted through the ballroom. Cameras continued capturing what looked like the perfect celebration. Yet beneath the polished surface, tension was quietly gathering. Victoria sat beside Ethan at the head table, her expression calm enough to fool everyone except herself. The conversations she had throughout the evening refused to leave her mind. Margaret's hesitation, Daniel's honesty, the respect former employees showed Naomi. Piece by piece, the version of history Ethan had presented was unraveling. Across the room, Naomi remained near the window overlooking the river. She had become an unexpected center of gravity inside the ballroom, not because she demanded attention, but because people naturally gravitated toward her. Several guests stopped to speak with her. Others simply nodded respectfully as they passed. Every interaction seemed genuine. Victoria noticed all of it. Ethan noticed it too. The master of ceremonies stepped onto the stage and welcomed everyone to the final portion of the reception. Applause echoed across the room. One by one, selected guests shared stories about the couple. There were jokes, memories, predictions about the future. The atmosphere gradually relaxed again. Then Ethan rose from his chair. The room immediately quieted. He accepted the microphone with practiced confidence and smiled at the crowd. I want to thank everyone for joining us tonight. Warm applause followed. Ethan waited for silence before continuing. Victoria has brought incredible happiness into my life. More applause. He turned toward his bride and reached for her hand. The gesture looked perfect, almost cinematic. Yet Victoria felt strangely disconnected from the moment. Ethan continued speaking. Life teaches us lessons, sometimes difficult lessons. Naomi lowered her gaze slightly. She already recognized the direction of the speech. Sometimes we spend years trying to build something that was never meant to last. A few guests shifted uncomfortably. Ethan smiled as though the comment were harmless. And sometimes we are fortunate enough to get a second chance. His eyes briefly drifted toward Naomi. The movement lasted less than a second. It was enough. Victoria saw it. So did several guests. The room grew subtly quieter. Ethan continued. I am grateful that life eventually led me to the right person. This time the silence felt different. Even the orchestra seemed to fade into the background. Victoria looked around the ballroom. She saw people avoiding eye contact. She saw discomfort. She saw recognition. And for the first time all evening, she understood something with complete clarity. This was not an accident. Ethan had invited Naomi here for a reason. He wanted an audience. He wanted comparison. He wanted validation. The realization settled over Victoria like cold water. Across the room, Naomi remained composed. No anger. No reaction. No attempt to defend herself. Her dignity only made Ethan's behavior appear smaller. Victoria looked back at the man standing beside her. The man she had agreed to marry. The man who claimed to value integrity above everything else. Suddenly, she wondered how many other stories had been rewritten to serve his image. How many truths had been edited until they became convenient. The applause that followed Ethan's speech sounded weaker than before. As he returned to his seat, he seemed unaware of the shift happening around him. But Victoria felt it. The room had changed. And so had she. Because while Ethan believed he had successfully controlled the narrative, Victoria had already reached a decision. Before this night ended, she was going to learn the complete truth directly from the one person who had never once tried to tell her what to think. And as her eyes found Naomi across the ballroom, she quietly rose from her chair. Victoria crossed the ballroom slowly, her ivory gown catching the golden light as conversations softened around her. Guests watched with polite curiosity, assuming she was simply greeting another attendee. Only Naomi seemed unsurprised. She set down her glass and met Victoria's approach with the same calm composure she had maintained all evening. For a moment, neither woman spoke. The music drifted through the room. Crystal chandeliers scattered reflections across the marble floor. Beyond the towering windows, the Chicago skyline shimmered against the dark river. Finally, Victoria offered a small smile. May I sit with you for a moment? Naomi nodded toward the empty chair beside her. Of course. Victoria settled into the seat and looked down briefly at her hands. For the first time all day, she seemed uncertain. I think I owe you an apology. Naomi tilted her head slightly. For what? Victoria let out a quiet breath. For believing a story about you without ever asking whether it was true. Naomi studied her for a moment before answering. That happens more often than people realize. There was no bitterness in her voice. No accusation. Somehow that made the words even more powerful. Victoria looked toward Ethan across the ballroom. He was surrounded by guests, laughing confidently, completely unaware that the foundation beneath him was beginning to shift. Were you really part of building his company? She asked softly. Naomi hesitated, not because she wished to hide the truth, but because she had spent years no longer needing to explain it. Yes. Victoria waited. Naomi continued. A lot of people helped build it. I was one of them. Daniel Mercer said there might not have been a company without you. Naomi gave a faint smile. Daniel has always been generous. Was Ethan lying? The question hung between them. Naomi looked out toward the river. The truth is rarely as simple as a lie. Victoria remained silent. Naomi folded her hands calmly in her lap. When Ethan and I started, we were a team. We both sacrificed. We both worked. We both believed in the future. Her eyes reflected the city lights beyond the glass. Success changes some people. Not always for the better. Victoria felt something tighten in her chest. Because Naomi never attacked Ethan. Never insulted him. Never tried to win sympathy. She simply spoke the truth and allowed it to stand on its own. Why did you come tonight? Victoria finally asked. Naomi's answer arrived immediately. Because I refused to let someone else decide whether I belonged in a room. The simplicity of the response left Victoria speechless. Across the ballroom, Ethan noticed the two women speaking. His smile faded. He excused himself from a group of investors and started moving toward them. Victoria saw him coming. So did Naomi. Neither woman reacted. Ethan arrived moments later. Everything all right? He asked, forcing a pleasant tone. Victoria looked up at him. For the first time all evening, she truly saw him. Not the polished executive. Not the charismatic public figure. Just a man desperately trying to control a narrative. Actually, Victoria said quietly, I have been learning some interesting things tonight. A flicker of concern crossed Ethan's face. What does that mean? Victoria rose from her chair. The movement drew attention from nearby guests. Several conversations slowed. A few people turned to watch. It means, she said calmly, that I think there are parts of your story I have never heard. The ballroom suddenly felt very still. Ethan glanced at Naomi before returning his attention to Victoria. This is not the time for that discussion. I disagree. Victoria's voice remained calm, but something had changed. The uncertainty was gone. In its place stood conviction. Around them, guests were beginning to notice. Investors, friends, family members. One by one, eyes turned toward the growing tension. Naomi remained seated, silent and composed beneath the crystal light. Ethan looked around the room and realized people were watching. The perfect evening he had orchestrated was no longer following his script. And as Victoria took a slow step toward the stage where the microphone still rested beneath the spotlight, a wave of unease spread across the ballroom.